Order, order, and a very warm welcome to this Safeguarding Vulnerable Claimants inquiry panel. Perhaps the panel would like to introduce themselves, starting from that end, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Tim Nicholls. I'm the Assistant Director of Policy Research and Strategy at the National Autistic Society.
Thank you.
Hi, Minesh Patel. I'm Associate Director of Policy and Influencing at the mental health charity Mind.
I'm Carri Swann. I'm a Welfare Rights Advisor at Child Poverty Action Group.
Morning, I'm Sophie Francis-Cansfield. I'm Head of Policy at Women's Aid, a national domestic abuse charity for women and children.
Very warm welcome to all of you, and I'm going to hand over to John Mill.
Thank you. Yes, there's been a lot of discussion about whether to introduce a statutory safeguarding duty to the DWP, and broadly, as far as I can see, the department is, shall we say, less keen, and external bodies are more keen on the duty. Where do you come on it? Where are you coming from? What do you think? Do you think it'd be a net positive or a negative, or what?
So from Women's Aid's perspective, we would really encourage the implementation of a safeguarding duty. I think there's kind of, for us, three core reasons. The first around the fact that it would meet a number of the department's actual objectives, kind of particularly around maximising employment, but also improving kind of people's quality of life. So I think it's well evidenced that kind of applying for an array of benefits, but particularly universal credit, is incredibly stressful and has an array of kind of negative impacts on individuals, but particularly for kind of survivors of domestic abuse who've, experienced all sorts of horrendous experiences and traumas. They kind of talk about how the applying for the benefit and interactions that they've had with job centres both kind of recalls but also mirrors the abuse that they've experienced from their perpetrator. I think it would also kind of tackle some of the culture that we've long known that exists within the department. We've had former DWP employees tell us that there is no incentive to be curious or understanding or compassionate about what a claimant has experienced. And I think some of the discretion that work coaches have available to them, the combination of not having that curiosity or understanding and that discretion shows that through the kind of the decisions that they're making, and they're not necessarily putting in the appropriate tailored approaches to that dedicated claimant. But then more widely, when we take a kind of wider government lens, this is the current government have pledged to halve violence against women and girls in a decade. And if we're not taking into account kind of women and children's experiences of domestic abuse and, their very specific economic needs, we're not going to make progress in that. But even before a kind of broader safeguarding duty is put in place, organisations like Women's Aid and others have long called for their department to just do a general assessment of kind of provisions they put in place on kind of survivors of domestic abuse. So whether it's kind of putting additional barriers to preventing them leaving, and that would be at no cost to the department, even before a kind of broader safeguarding duty is put in place.
Child Poverty Action Group would support the imposition of a statutory duty as well. Is it appropriate to impose that kind of duty on a body like the DWP? We would say yes, given the type and magnitude of the power that DWP has in people's lives, and the harm and, unfortunately, deaths that we've seen sometimes associated with the use of that power or the threat of exercising that power in certain ways. So yes, we see it as appropriate. Would it be effective is a much harder question, obviously, to answer. But we're a charity that uses the law to help uphold claimants' rights. So we generally support the DWP's obligations being put on a legal footing, on a statutory footing, so that it is very clear to everybody involved what the rules are, so that there's accountability to Parliament and the public. What could a safeguarding duty look like? Again, a very difficult question and quite a nebulous topic. But in our submission, we suggested 4 types of duty that already exist in other public bodies. And I'm going to focus on 2 of those. One would be a statutory duty of disclosure. So a duty on the DWP to disclose to third parties, for example, support networks, other agencies, when there is about to be a risk to a claimant. Also a duty of inquiry, or an enhanced duty of inquiry, so that the DWP has to make certain inquiries, seek out further medical information, for example, before making certain decisions about someone's benefits. So those 2 types of duty, the duty to warn and consult with third parties, we believe could be particularly effective. The bottom line for us, I will quickly say, is that although accountability is so important, we can see the downside of simply holding the government accountable after the fact. And so we think beyond a safeguarding duty, there should be upstream changes to benefit rules that prevent these very acute situations and risks from arising. I hope I'll have an opportunity to talk more to that later.
So at Mind we would support the principle of a statutory safeguarding duty and agree with lots of what Sophie and Carri have said. And what we see is for people with mental health problem, where safeguards are applied, this can often be inconsistent across the application process for benefits, inconsistent across different types of benefits. So we think having a statutory duty would help to ensure more consistency in terms of the process. And I think similar to Carri, for us, if somebody is identified as having a mental health problem, that in itself should act as a trigger for gathering more information to understand more about the needs of that individual, and again working closely with third-party organisations. And hopefully we'll come on to this, but we see real challenges with how information is sort of perceived, the credibility of information from third-party organisations. But that's really important to build up that holistic picture of somebody's needs and what support and adjustments they may need when applying for benefits.
And yes, it probably won't surprise people, but in principle, the National Autistic Society can see the benefits of a statutory duty. However, I think I have 3 caveats that probably line up fairly well with what we've already heard. But one is that it very much depends on how that duty is framed, how definition of vulnerability is framed as well. If you compare it with some other statutory regimes, such as in social care, the bar there is incredibly high. And we hear day in, day out from autistic people who are not able to get the support when safeguarding concerns are raised. And I'm sure as constituency MPs, you have probably also been in a situation where you've been wanting to refer people for safeguarding support and have found that can be a tricky situation. So we need a system and a duty that doesn't rely on people being fully in crisis before it's triggered. The second is paramount, which I think other people on the panel have covered well, so I won't go into it, but it's what does that duty lead to? Because a safeguarding duty and acknowledging someone's vulnerability in and of itself will be pointless if it doesn't improve someone's experience of the pipeline of applying for benefits. And that leads me on to a third bit, which is the importance of it being underpinned by a solid awareness of people's disability. So when we ask autistic people whether they feel like assessors within the benefit system understand what autism is and whether they feel like they are able to make the right decision about an autistic person because of that knowledge, we get a resounding no. So we did a recent survey where 70% of respondents, it was only a very small survey, 70% of respondents told us they didn't feel that DWP or assessors had a sufficient understanding of autism. And that completely lines up with historic surveys that we've done as well. So in 2019, we had exactly the same from a survey of 10,000 people. And before that, in the early 20-teens, we did a similar thing. This is not a new thing, absolutely. And it is time, I think, that we made sure that there is a solid understanding of disability and of people's needs throughout the benefit system, because actually that is the foundation upon which any kind of framework around safeguarding would be based.
Thank you. Well, pretty unanimous verdict there. The government's already committed to introducing a general duty of candour, which is obviously relates to some of these issues, but would you say that wouldn't be sufficient in itself? You still think we need to go further?
If I can, I'm afraid it's not an area of our expertise, but I note in the earlier evidence from the PHSO last year the then PHSO, his quite dim view of the duty of candour in the NHS and the efficacy of that duty. So I think it would have to go further from our perspective.
Anybody else want to answer that particular?
I think just in terms of some of the kind of department's current responsibilities and duties, the candour, but also its public sector equality duty, you know, we unfortunately do regularly see the department not meeting those duties. So, you know, as kind of the panel have set out, there's clearly an array of key issues to address within a kind of a further safeguarding duty to kind of address the existing issues that have kind of long been held. But, you know, unfortunately, what exists isn't sufficient, and we are seeing harm happening to vulnerable claimants on a regular daily basis. So there is clear need to for further action.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Darling.
Thank you. Tim has already slightly touched on this area already, so I just would be really grateful if the panel can unpack what they see as the pros and cons around having a clear definition of what vulnerable is, because clearly the DWP doesn't have that definition at the moment. So what are the pros and cons around that? And then I'll be having a follow-up question after that.
Well, I suppose I can start by expanding on that a little bit. I think in terms of the pros, it can give certainty to people and at least give clarity around what the process should look like, which in terms of appeals and enforcement and being able to make complaints is an important thing as well. I think at the moment people are very unclear about what level of support they would get as they go through the process. The focus is much more probably on the outcome, and offers even around reasonable adjustments are patchy within the benefit system. Just an anecdotal example, back when universal credit was first rolled out, you were allowed to ask for a different process because it requires a phone call. Many autistic people might find a phone call very stressful and find it difficult to engage with. There was a reasonably adjust pathway, but it was not advertised anywhere. So it meant it wasn't actually, in essence, accessible. So there are pros in terms of giving certainty, but I think in terms of cons, it's important to acknowledge, I think, that we have a system that is under significant strain, and whether the system will be able to effectively meet the requirements of a statutory duty without significant work and getting the system right, that's going to be an issue. So the cons could be, when I say the pros could be that it makes it clearer, the cons are that it could make it unclearer, and it very much depends on implementation, I think.
If I can build upon that, so I think similar to Tim, pros would be a more consistent experience for claimants, and if you've identified certain circumstances, certain situations, again, that acting as a trigger for thinking about adjustments and support. I think on the flip side, and taking mental health, vulnerability is a really individual and personal thing, and what that means for one person will be different to another person. So having enough guidance in terms of what vulnerability is, but that shouldn't supersede still having that individual conversation with somebody, because vulnerability may not be immediately apparent. So I think kind of a framework of vulnerability to guide the conversation, but that may not cover everything. So I think kind of the wording and the support and training that sits around any sort of vulnerability framework would be really important.
Can I build on Tim and Minesh's list of cons? What we know, I think, is that the most vulnerable claimants might be the least capable of registering their vulnerability with the DWP. And I think Professor McManus made a similar point to the inquiry last year. And we shouldn't underestimate that when vulnerable claimants do self-register their vulnerability and request adjustments or flexibility, those requests are often refused. So it is not simply an inability to self-register, it is that self-registration attempts are not always accepted. So that is a problem with relying on sort of a vulnerability flag or definition. We shouldn't rely on those frontline staff to spot vulnerability either. And there are issues, as I think Tim and Minesh have pointed out, about labelling, requiring people to identify as something that they might not identify as, something that could be quite disempowering. Also, problems with having a definition that's too narrow to be usable or too wide to actually mean anything. And I think that when the DWP has attempted to define vulnerability, for example, in its guidance to PIP assessment providers, the definition has sometimes been so wide as to almost lose its meaning. So our recommendation, I think, would be not to attach safeguarding measures to particular types of claimant, but to particular types of decision or action in the benefit system. Because there are particular types of decision or action that we can see would place even quite a broad-shouldered claimant at risk. Switching off the whole of someone's universal credit award while you investigate them for fraud, for example, is enough to render any person or family vulnerable. If they weren't before, that doesn't matter anymore. So, as I say, we would attach it to processes, to decisions, rather than to types of people. Thank you.
I think a lot of the points that the panel have covered are very valid and true. I think Minesh's point particular around vulnerability is particularly true in the case of survivors of domestic abuse. And I think Carri's point kind of around some of the most vulnerable really touches on those particularly marginalised survivors who really face kind of additional barriers, you know, particularly language barriers if English isn't their first language. So I think a lot of the points that have been discussed around the kind of the challenges of having a definition of vulnerability are being covered. So I suppose I would point to some of the department's work about becoming trauma-informed and how that work is explicitly linked to an understanding of vulnerability, because if some of the processes, applications and decisions were more trauma-informed and there was greater trauma awareness across the department, I think some of the challenges that survivors of domestic abuse and wider vulnerable claimants face would potentially improve, and we would not potentially see as much inconsistency or unnuanced interpretation of certain kind of processes and applications that currently do happen.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie. And Sophie, you nicely queued me up for my next question, where I wanted to actually unpack professional curiosity. I know quite often when Ofsted are reviewing social care, and although this isn't social care, it's not a million miles away from dealing with people who face challenges. Quite often the lack of professional curiosity and having a culture around encouraging professional curiosity is really important, particularly if you understand trauma-informed world. I'd welcome your reflections on developing a culture within the DWP when dealing with claims around professional curiosity to try and drive better outcomes for claimants.
Yeah, I think there is, as kind of set out in my response to the kind of safeguarding duty question, I think there is a real need to tackle some of the culture because there is a lack of, well, as a former DWP employee told Women's Aid, there is a kind of, you are not incentivized to understand or be curious about the wider situation of a claimant, because there is so much focus on just kind of driving claimants into employment, even if it doesn't mean they're going to be in it in the long term, because a suitable tailored approach hasn't been taken. And I think, you know, when we speak to our members and survivors of domestic abuse, you know, their experience can range from, you know, something that I don't even think any of us would necessarily think is a response to someone who's particularly vulnerable. But, you know, we had a survivor who had fled her perpetrator when she was 2 months pregnant, and further down the line she was in the job centre. She felt a little bit dizzy and asked for a glass of water, and she was told no, she wasn't allowed a glass of water. So even the kind of the basics of just kind of human decency, you know, not necessarily kind of additional measures you would take for kind of a particularly vulnerable claimant. So there is clearly just a general wider culture, but then that culture of not having that curiosity, and that's, I think, has been found by pretty much kind of all the organisations represented here, but then kind of wider think tanks such as IPPR and other reports have very much found that.
What I'd add to that, and I agree with everything Sophie has said, I think, what I'd add to that is giving DWP staff the benefit of the doubt. Many of them, are doing very challenging jobs for all the right reasons. What is stopping them from getting it right in every case? And I would point to, I think, the question of caseload and the time available to dedicate to individuals. And I think that the inquiry's own survey of DWP staff, which asked a few questions about, are you able to following safeguarding guidance and so on, timing and having the time to carefully follow guidance was the one area where staff most strongly disagreed and said they did not have what they needed. So there may be, that there is clearly a gulf between what the guidance says should happen and what happens in practice. If we are looking for root causes, it is not my place to speculate. I do not work at the DWP, but time to dedicate to people seems as important as new guidance, new training and other measures.
If I can just build upon that quickly, I think one thing that would help is making more decisions based upon a paper assessment. So you've got enough information there to determine whether somebody's entitled to benefits, what that award is, rather than having to make them go through a face-to-face assessment. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic, and I think in the white paper, there's a willingness to explore doing more of that. But I think that would help to then free up more of the time of work coaches to give that more in-depth, holistic, personalised support to people who there is a need for that face-to-face assessment.
And sorry, just an additional way to do that. I think that not bringing in for people for face-to-face assessments when they're not necessary is very important. The other thing that can be unnecessary is too frequent reassessments, which autism is a lifelong disability. While your needs may change throughout your life, for many people they will be relatively stable and they will be in the same situation for a number of years. To have to come back every 2 or 3 years is placing burden on them and the system that could be avoidable. I think just in terms of professional curiosity, I very much agree with what the panel have said, and I think if we're looking at something like a duty of candour or just incentivising people around it won't work. The issue is we have a system that is very robotic, essentially, and fundamentally unperson-centred. You cannot have... that does not give space for professional curiosity. It doesn't allow any space. And so actually, if you're looking to improve professional curiosity, there's a lot of work around making the rest of the system work better that needs to be done as well. And I think that point's been really well made by Carri and Sophie.
Thank you, Steve. Over to Jo Baxter.
Morning. So how easy or not do you think it is for vulnerable claimants and those who support them to access the additional support measures that are available to them by the DWP?
I think, first of all, there's a question about how can they find out what these measures are. And it's been said by other witnesses previously, but it is not easy. The guidance, the information is quite piecemeal. It can be not in the public domain. It can be sort of internal guidance. And it can take quite a well-resourced expert to find the answers to what are quite simple questions about what support should be offered. In 2023, I wrote a benefits and mental health handbook, which I'm going to wave at the committee, with an author from Mind. And we wanted to include a chapter on the additional support available in the benefits system. And from the footnotes to that chapter, you can see how many sources we had to consult, as I say, to answer what should be quite simple questions. So in our submission, we called for a single safeguarding summary on gov.uk that could be accessed by claimants and by the people and agencies supporting them. Just looking at those sort of flexibilities and additional support measures consistently applied, that the short answer I would say is they are not, unfortunately. And we have evidence of that from our work collecting case studies from benefits advisors. Our early warning system project, as it's known, it's collected I think 10,000 or more case studies now about issues in the benefits system, and a lot of those are about these additional support measures not being applied when they should be. Thank you.
I think, similar points to what Carri said. I think it can be quite fiendish and difficult to understand what support is out there, and so Mind, in terms of our setup, we've got a national organisation and then over 100 local organisations who work directly with people across a range of issues, providing help and support. And what we hear from local advisors often is when they're supporting people with their benefit claims, it's often when people are at the point of crisis, distress, they're really struggling, and often it can be not as simple as, but the independent advisor or a member of local staff knowing what language to use. So, for instance, talking about the Equality Act and the duties of the DWP under that Act, and that can kick things into motion. So it shouldn't get to this point where you're using certain language and phrasing to get the support that you need. It should be baked in and clear from the start, and ultimately a system which offers choice and support from the start and then provides additional adjustments along the way. So that's something we observe, that when you use the right language, that can sometimes change things, but it shouldn't be that way.
Direct answer to how easy is it for claimants to get additional support, and from what we hear, it isn't. Just quite simply, they aren't able to access it. And so in that small survey that we ran recently, almost all, so 97% of people told us that it was either somewhat or very difficult to navigate the assessment process. Now, while that's not a direct answer to your question, it does point to the fact that they were not able to access necessarily the support they needed to make that claim. For some people, that will be because their first interaction at the front door has been particularly bad, and they've not got the information they need, had a very stressful experience, or simply haven't been able to get in. And to use a very real example of a young guy that I heard of a few years ago, he had gone to the Job Centre Plus to ask for support around his benefits. He was autistic. Making the journey in itself was stressful. His way of coping with the journey: hood up, headphones on, to block out some of the sensory overload. When he walked in through the door of the job centre, the security guard was telling him to take his hood down. He had his headphones on. So the security guard reached out and grabbed him, and that was extremely difficult for the autistic person. He had a meltdown right there in reception. He was unable to then go in and get the support that he needed. Now, that's just one example, obviously, but there are so many different ways in which the first interaction at front door can further render someone vulnerable or disable them from getting the support that they need.
I would agree with kind of what everyone has said around it is not easy. And I think when we have engaged our members on this, they have said, they do not find that it is proactively offered. And I think kind of Minesh touched on language, and I think particularly for our by and for member services, particularly those supporting Black and minoritized survivors, the fact that it often, information is not available in any other language other than English. So the fact that, we're not making it available in kind of multiple common other languages, and I think there's a pamphlet around the kind of access to wider support, and within that pamphlet it talks about access to BSL, but that pamphlet isn't available in anything other than English. So it's slightly contradictory to talk about wider accessible versions in an inaccessible document, and there is no large print or other formats. So we are making it, for those particularly marginalised individuals, incredibly challenging when it comes to language and communication barriers.
Actually, that brings me quite neatly on to, I was going to ask you about the pamphlet that was published in March 2024 on the additional support for DWP customers. Is that the pamphlet you were referring to? So that in itself is not available in other languages?
Not kind of from the online version is just available in English, and kind of more broadly, it's, you know, even as someone kind of navigating it as a professional, you know, it's hard to separate out what directly a claimant would be able to access versus kind of measures the department is undertaking more broadly in terms of their kind of work around kind of vulnerable claimants. So, you know, there's no contents page. It's kind of, you know, if you were kind of looking for information quite quickly, it'd be quite hard to navigate as a document. And as I say, ironically talks about accessible versions within an inaccessible document.
And what's the view from others in terms of how helpful or not that pamphlet has been in trying to give people information about what support might be available to them?
It's a brochure of or a manifesto of the DWP's approach to safeguarding and some measures it has put in place. It is not structured. It is not in claimant-friendly language. Right. It doesn't. It's not a guide. And what I think we would like to see is a guide that people can use to look up particular problems.
Yeah, I mean, no sort of additional points to add beyond the fact that sort of human interaction to really understand what somebody needs. You know, that's paramount alongside any guides and support that also exists.
I think that last point is really important. I think if we're looking to a booklet to be the answer to accessibility, we're on a hiding to nothing. It's not. It has to be part of a wider system support and a culture change for all the reasons that the panel has already spoken about. But when you are trying to figure out what support someone needs, what you're actually going to need to facilitate in generally is a good conversation. And so not having that human element to it is frankly puts all the onus on the claimant rather than the system to navigate a system that is opaque, complicated, and fraught with anxiety.
If we're going to put in place measures to improve communication about what additional supports are available, so for some people, I'm guessing this is going to look very different because some people might be more comfortable looking to a guide rather than going in the front door, but for others it may be the opposite. How do you think the department should square that circle in terms of improving the communications with claimants about the support they can access?
I think one way would be just to directly speak to kind of people who have experience of the system or kind of, you know, have experience of different vulnerabilities. I think something for me that's also really lacking in the kind of brochure pamphlet is the fact it doesn't signpost to wider support. So I would very much expect to see kind of National Autistic Society. I would expect to see those organisations listed alongside Women's Aid, homelessness charities, because, you know, it's claimants might be experiencing DWP directly. You know, they might not necessarily have engagement with one of our services first before engaging with them. So, you know, we would hope that, as we would hope that all government departments are also signposting to the kind of full breadth of support that is out there, because, you know, they might not recognise their experience, particularly with survivors of domestic abuse. You know, we know how long it takes for them to leave and recognise their experiences, so we should be signposting at all opportunities. And these are kind of these public-facing documents, or whether it be a conversation at Job Centre, are key opportunities to be doing that.
I agree.
Thank you.
We're going to have to speed up slightly in terms of our responses, if that's okay. And I know that Steve Darling is going to set an excellent example in that regard.
So you've really been helpful already highlighting some barriers that claimants may face. Are there any barriers that you might want to amplify or show to us that you're aware that claimants may be facing, particularly where their vulnerability may be exacerbated by the barriers that they're facing?
If I can add one to begin with, and I will be brief. So I think with people we speak to with mental health problem, there can be a range of challenges engaging with the system, which I'm sure are similar for other groups of individuals. So that might be, a real fear of receiving that brown envelope from the DWP, difficulty understanding the information, challenges with the assessment method and type, but also when you're having a face-to-face assessment, the trauma that can be triggered from talking about experiences relating to mental health or other conditions or impairments, and that in itself can amplify somebody's mental health problem or even cause a mental health problem or mental health distress. So I think that leads me to the point I was making earlier about, as much as possible, trying to avoid a face-to-face assessment to simplify and streamline the process to avoid inadvertently causing additional risk or harm to claimants, and that's specifically for mental health, but I'm sure that's similar for other conditions experiences as well.
Yeah, I think particular barriers for survivors of domestic abuse, there are kind of real practical barriers, whether it be kind of lack of access to ID, either because their perpetrator has withheld it from them, or when they had to flee, they were unable to take it with them. And that, of course, causes issues in terms of setting up a bank account, making your claim, etc. Other barriers, as I've kind of touched on in previous answers, around kind of language barriers and kind of not having regular access to translators through the kind of job centre. We know from, for example, our member Al Hassaniya in London, who supports Moroccan and Arabic women, that the job centre just said they didn't have budget for translators, even though it's part of their public sector equality duty. And that then puts additional strain on frontline specialist services. Or, it leaves survivors having to either kind of make their own way through a claim and potentially miss out sections that they don't fully understand, and then their claim isn't continued, or they're reliant on friends, family, strangers, professionals, and then they might miss, again, key bits of information, or by the time it's reached them in translated form. But then kind of a final one from me would just be around the kind of the lack of understanding of that kind of psychological aspect of domestic abuse, and how the kind of certain processes and stresses of going through different applications or reviews or assessments, how that can mirror the abuse that they've experienced.
Just, if I can briefly just add on, it's from the perspective of the National Autistic Society, I think two additional ones to add. First is barriers, physical barriers around accessing Job Centre Plus, for example, when you need advice. And obviously I've given one example around that already. We ran a really good pilot with Job Centre Plus before the pandemic around an inclusion accreditation, essentially. Piloted it with just over a dozen Job Centre Pluses. The experiences of that were really, really positive. But the DWP hasn't been able to roll that out, and I think that would be something that would work for a wide variety of claimants, actually, tackling sensory environment, physical environment, and attitudes and understanding within the office. And then the second barrier, as I think came out in my first answer, is really strong. It's about lack of understanding and awareness of autism and what autistic people may need, and also what that may mean for their day-to-day life, so that you can assess their benefits. Situation is an incredibly important barrier, but it's a significant barrier that people face.
Thank you, Steve. And now I'm handing over to David Pintu-Duchensky.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for your evidence. It's incredibly helpful, and we've heard a lot about both how vulnerable people interact with DWP, and also how the system can itself exacerbate through its processes some of the vulnerabilities that people face. I suppose my question then pivots to, so what should we do about that? And I suppose I'd really like to focus on, when developing new policies, how do you think DWP can ensure that it doesn't exacerbate vulnerabilities? What steps, how should the policy and kind of procedure development process look? And I suppose, and how should it look while simultaneously maintaining the integrity of the system? So we appreciate there does need to be conditionality. We can't just do away with it etc. How do you create a design process that strikes that balance?
I think fairly succinctly for Women's Aid, we've long called for the department to assess the impact of any change it makes to kind of benefits or processes in terms the impact it has on a survivor's ability to flee and stay fled. Fleeing is incredibly expensive. Our price of safety report highlighted that on average it can cost a survivor £50,000 to flee. And if they were able to access all the entitlements and benefits they were able to, which of course rarely happens, that would still leave a £10,000 deficit. And for survivors, migrant survivors, that would be a £20,000 deficit. So, if we are wanting to kind of support survivors to flee for their safety and to stay fled and live stable lives where they are able to engage in employment, we need to be able to assess whether we're enabling them to flee. And at the moment, because of the gaps in the system, we are very grateful to other departments, such as the Home Office, who are providing funding to the Flexible Fund, which is then making up for the gaps in the social security system for survivors.
I would say the biggest thing is to listen. Listen to the experiences of the people who are applying for benefits, so for autistic and disabled and neurodivergent people, listening to them in the creation of these systems and in the creation of policy proposals. That means going beyond typical government consultation. It means being really open and honest. It could involve co-production and co-design. That would be the way that you would shift to much better policy decision making that would meet the needs of people to a much greater extent. And I think the second thing just to note is that many of the changes around the benefits system over the last 15 or so years have been driven by the bottom line. They have set out a financial target they wish to achieve. There was one attached to PIP when it was first set up. It never met it because it was unrealistic. But it does mean that you have the wrong incentives in the creation of that system. You're going to create a policy and a system that is designed to achieve the bottom line, not to improve people's lives. And that's the wrong perspective to be having. So we need to look at what the objectives of policy actually are before they do it. And that's going to be really important, particularly as the current government have said that they still anticipate to make the savings in that the last government's Green Paper suggested, but have not yet added the detail of the how. And that's all the devil in the detail there.
2 points. About the integrity of the benefit system, it's such an important point. Rules come out of Parliament, we have to respect those. There are features that we can't do away with in the benefit system. There will always be people who lose entitlement to sources of income. But we also have to be able to spot avoidable harm, and I think that's the root of the question. So we need to make sure that internal process reviews and other safeguarding measures that the DWP already has feed into policy making. So they don't just feed back to operational teams who've perhaps made mistakes, they need to feed into policy making. I don't think that is clear in their terms of reference at the moment. But number 2, we also need to do risk assessment in the way that we do in so many other spheres. We need to look when we're producing a new rule or updating a scheme. We need to look at who does it affect, what is the magnitude of the risk to that person or group, and what is the likelihood of the risk. And there may be a small likelihood, but a very large magnitude if a risk materialises, and we need to think about that. So any new or review of a policy that takes away income, particularly if it does that suddenly, and also, as the witnesses have said, some of these policies that make vulnerable people recount their own experiences or deal face-to-face or with professionals with whom they do not feel, safe or comfortable.
I could just add very briefly to what Tim said and fellow panellists, that point around listening and involving disabled people claiming and accessing benefits genuinely and shaping co-producing the system. We really welcomed the proposal in the Get Britain Working white paper to create a disabled persons panel to shape the department's thinking, we think that is actually a really positive shift and, you know, a good start to build upon to genuinely ensure you've got that feedback loop to inform policy decisions and not just the operational decisions, as has been said before me.
Great, thank you. And I suppose a follow-up to that is, so that's very clear, and thank you for that. Obviously, DWP has talked about in introducing a trauma-informed approach. Are you seeing those, you know, these suggestions reflected in the trauma-informed approach? Are there any gaps that you think need to be addressed to improve its impact?
I think, I mean, if I can kick off with one point, and a point which has been raised several times, I think that there's a big challenge within culture, within DWP when it comes to assessments, a culture which is built around compliance, around achieving the bottom line. And I think until we shift from a culture which is built around compassion, genuine engagement, believing what the individual is saying, that will undermine, you know, the good intent around trauma-informed approaches. So that's quite a big sort of concern for us at Mind in terms of genuinely ensuring we are thinking about trauma when having conversations with people about benefits or employment.
On the operational side, kind of cautiously optimistic about a trauma-informed approach, but again, thinking about the conflicting pressures on staff. Do they have a conflicting incentive to do something else? Do they have time pressures, which mean they can't put their training or their guidance into practice? And on the policy side, will the trauma-informed approach feed through to policy making? We haven't seen that yet.
I'd agree with what Minesh and Carri have said.
Thank you. And so, look, one very specific example of where these kind of things could bite, where the rubber could hit the road, is in the managed migration of people currently on ESA and other forms of benefit onto UC. And I know, Carri, you've talked about the fact that CPAG have talked about the fact that this migration poses serious safeguarding concerns, and I think you've laid some of them out. But could you touch on those concerns, and specifically could we touch on also to what extent the enhanced support journey might mitigate those concerns, and what needs to be done to make sure it does?
Thank you. Our major concern with managed migration is that it has been designed as a mass benefit switch off, if you like. Claimants are being required to actively claim their new replacement universal credit benefit, and their legacy benefits are then being switched off, rather than claimants being automatically moved from the old to the new, which was another choice open to the DWP and wasn't taken. So that's created a risk. I would say that is one of the avoidable risks I referred to earlier. Other decisions have been made along the line which have done nothing to mitigate that risk. So, for example, we have seen scaling up of managed migration without, we would say, robust evidence that it is safe and that the safety measures I'll come on to are strong enough. We've also seen that the planned closure of the Move to UC programme, so that the sort of the policy side of managed migration, that programme closes this March. So at the very height of the move of ESA claimants, some of the most vulnerable in the system, to universal credit. So again, I think those decisions have done nothing to mitigate the risks. You've mentioned the enhanced support journey, which I think is DWP's main concession to safeguarding in managed migration. The shortcomings of that journey are one, that it does not apply to everyone, so it applies to a subset of claimants, ESA claimants, and some income support claimants identified by the DWP as particularly vulnerable, but we don't know how that identification takes place. Number two, it is called a support journey, but really it is a journey of additional reminders rather than active support. So some claimants will, for example, get a home visit to help them remember that they need to claim universal credit and that old benefit is stopping. That home visit does not include help to make that universal credit claim. So that, again, we would say is a real shortcoming. And finally, the end of the enhanced support journey is where a claimant who has totally failed to engage, who hasn't made their universal credit claim and has hit the deadline for the switch off of their old benefits, the DWP can exercise discretion about escalating their case. But what we don't know is what criteria it will use to decide whether to escalate. And again, perhaps if there were a statutory duty on the DWP setting out in more detail its safeguarding responsibilities, we wouldn't be quite so in the dark about when escalation will and won't happen. So at the moment we are in a situation, as I say, where ESA claimants are being moved in very large numbers, hundreds of thousands by the end of this year, and it is a huge source of concern and a timely point at which to raise those concerns, I think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's Frank McNally.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. We have spoke a little today around the training that staff have got, and I know that a number of members of the panel have highlighted that staff may not be getting the opportunity to put that training into practice. And training is an area I want to sort of focus on in our question just now. The DWP has highlighted what it describes as a comprehensive training package for staff engaging with vulnerable claimants on a daily basis, and many of those will be multifaceted, will be complex. So I'm keen to get a sense from you how sufficient you believe the training for DWP staff is, and if there are areas where there is a requirement for a much greater focus. Yep, Tim.
I think if we're going to look at the impact of training, we have to start with the people who are going through the benefit system to find out what they think. And the answer I gave to the first question about the number of people who don't feel like their assessors have a sufficient level of training being as high as 7 in 10 suggests that it's not working. So I think what we might be looking at here is, while I am sure that the training package is sizable, and it probably covers an awful lot of information. Is it actually covering the right information? Now, over a series of years, the National Autistic Society has had some correspondence with DWP and providers around the scale and quality of its autism training. We have never been satisfied with the training materials that have been sent to us. Though we are, because we have been consulted, we are listed as having been consulted in the development of them. The extent of our consultation was to say that we are not satisfied and these need to be done again, just to put that on the record. And from when I looked at it, it was a lot of very clinical style information. And if we look at the types of assessments that people are going to need, it's about their day-to-day lives. There was very little information about that, and how that might be an issue for autistic people, what support autistic people might need, what the struggles with day-to-day management of bills, getting up and ready for work, or getting out or getting about might be. And so that's why I think, again, coming back to the previous answer I gave about if you want to know how to do training properly, listen, co-produce, co-design. I think that would be the best way forward, and I think you'll end up with not only better satisfaction within claimants, but probably much better satisfaction among the assessors and the workforce within DWP as well, who will feel that they're delivering a higher quality service and putting themselves, or being in fewer situations where they feel out of their depth and unsatisfied with the information that they've got at their fingertips.
I mean, I would echo lots of what Tim has said, and I would say, training is not just a one-off thing. So I think that needs to be repeated around mental health. We know that there's rising concerns around stigma around mental health. So how to address that in terms of the overall culture and training given to work coaches is really important as well.
One point, frontline DWP staff see so much. So many different people with different problems. So one thing I think we would support is having in-house expert teams in DWP, so that frontline staff faced with a problem on which they have limited training can escalate to an expert, someone with a higher level of training. And I think from our evidence from advisors dealing with frontline cases, we're not seeing that happen enough.
I think I'm wary when it comes to domestic abuse. This is an area that the department has kind of committed to kind of regularly updating its training. So I know the department refreshes its domestic abuse training on a 6-monthly basis. On a kind of all staff are kind of get a refresher every 2 years, and for caseworkers they get a kind of mid-year check-in. So from that basis, it isn't the kind of one-off approach that we do sometimes see. But I think in terms of an amalgamation of the points that have been made, I think I agree with Tim that there is still a real need in terms of what is included for there to be a greater focus on co-production and for that to be meaningful, not a kind of you've been consulted and your name gets listed but you're not actually satisfied with the content and what it's including. But then I think also in terms of what Carri said, there is so much, and with all the other challenges that we've spoken about this morning, we do think that whilst having champions and kind of leads isn't going to be the kind of the golden bullet, it is helpful in terms of the wider challenges that exist. So having a kind of domestic abuse lead in job centres would support with some of those kind of the breadth of challenges that they face on a kind of daily basis and the issues that they're seeing.
Thank you very much.
Over to Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Earlier in the session, the panel said there was a lack of incentive to be curious. Some of the panel said that. I just wondered what your views were on how well the DWP engages with external agencies such as local authorities and charities, particularly about supporting vulnerable claimants.
So I think this is an area where there could definitely be improvements. I spoke earlier about the idea of a duty of inquiry, so the duty of the DWP to seek out information and views. But I also talked about the idea of a duty of disclosure, so the DWP proactively going out and disclosing information about at-risk claimants. Now, the DWP has guidance on both of those. That there are reasons, which I won't speculate on, about why that doesn't always get applied in practice. But there are 2 points that our community of advisors tell us about that are particular problems. One is that if you're a third party trying to speak to the DWP about a particular case, you have quite limited routes in. There used to be direct forms of contact with the AXL group of professionals, so the Advanced Customer Support Senior Leaders within DWP. For about 2.5 years, stakeholders could refer cases direct to them. That option has been withdrawn, and now stakeholder organisations are told to go through business as usual routes, so they have to knock on the same door as everyone else. So direct routes of contact with safeguarding teams would be so valuable for that multi-agency working. And quickly, the second issue is around explicit consent for universal credit. So obviously the DWP has huge data protection responsibilities, but it does have a choice about how it meets those. Previously, it's had a system of implicit consent, which allowed it to talk to bodies who could answer certain data sort of security type questions about a claimant. Now it requires for universal credit something called explicit consent. So it needs the claimant to be there, or it needs the claimant to have put in writing their consent for their case to be discussed with this person. So that system isn't working.
Just cognizant of time, Chair.
Sorry.
Just a follow-up question on that. You mentioned about the need to have those clear routes. How do you see those routes existing and being developed?
Thank you. So in the past, for example, there have been direct telephone lines into certain benefit agencies. HMRC, for example, used to have a direct telephone line for advisors and accountants to speak about tax credits and child benefit. Shorter waiting times and straight through to someone who knew that you were a professional. An approach like that could be hugely valuable for agencies, multi-agency working between DWP and other organisations.
Thank you. And that concludes our first panel. Can I thank you so much for a really, really informative session. So thank you for your time. And if there's anything else that you want to add to the evidence that you've submitted here, then please do let us know. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of all that, it basically confirmed everything that I've heard and suspected.
Okay, colleagues, we'll call order again. And it's a very warm welcome to Dr. Gail Allsopp, who's the Chief Medical Advisor for the Department for Work and Pensions. Thank you so much for coming along to speak with us. I'm going to kick things off if that's okay. And just to understand more about your role and remit within the DWP, if you could explain that to us, please.
So just first of all to say I'm a medical doctor and still work in the NHS as a GP, but the vast majority of my time is spent at the Department of Work and Pensions, so I'm still on the front line as a clinician. I was appointed 16 months ago now, so I've been in the department for 16 months, and my role really has three broad remits, and I think one of them, the first one I'll talk about, is probably the most important for this committee, and that's that I'm the Senior Responsible Officer for Clinical Governance across the department. So in the last 16 months I've come in and I've assessed the clinical governance, and we've actually put a whole new process into place which does cover safeguarding, so I think that's probably quite important to talk about. I'm also the profession lead for the clinical profession at DWP, so there are 211 clinicians as of today who work across the department, and my role is to ensure that they are adequately qualified, making sure that they achieve their regulatory body status, and to bring the profession together really so that we've got a consistent voice across DWP. And then the third part is I'm the clinical policy lead, so I have a team of about 12, the equivalent of 12 full-time clinicians who advise on policy changes from the clinical aspect, but also then once the policy is written, the implementation of that policy from a clinical perspective.
Can you explain a little bit more about clinical governance? I mean, I used to work in the NHS myself, former NHS chair and public health consultant, so I have experience on that, but everybody else, including those who are watching, may not understand that.
Yeah, so clinical governance is a process of continuous improvement. And that's the most powerful thing about clinical governance for me, is that you never accept that you are at the gold standard. You are constantly being curious and trying to evolve the work that you do to improve things. And what we've done over the last 16 months is we've aligned the clinical governance within the department to that of the NHS, so really following best practice. And there are 7 pillars of clinical governance. So these cover a multitude of things, from the education and training of your healthcare providers who are undertaking the assessments, down to ensuring we have service user involvement within the work that we do in terms of making decisions and policy making.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned that you are still working as a GP, so how do you split your time?
So I am full-time at the department, and I have one morning a week that I go into general practice in Derbyshire. Okay.
Obviously, you were here during the first panel, and you probably heard some of the comments from the previous witnesses. One of the things that struck me listening to that was the importance of a system-wide approach, that the safeguarding is really important, but the prospective sort of analysis of how a clinical governance approach will be undertaken. So, for example, thinking about the work capability assessment and any changes that might be undertaken around that, what would be your role specifically within that?
from a work capability assessment perspective, we work very closely, my team does, with the WCA policy team. There are 3 members of my team who work specifically on the WCA clinical policy aspects. And we do a number of things. So when policy changes are considered or thought about, they come to my team to talk about the potential changes. And my team tend to do 3 things. And we focus everything about the effect on the claimant. That's the most important thing. So at the heart of every single thing that we do is how will these changes affect the individuals who are service users of the department? Not only in terms of how will the assessment take place, but also what would be the impact on them as individuals. And we often do case studies, for example, where we will write and bring to life the policy changes that are potentially being thought about in the department, so that those who are making the decisions actually see the real life people behind the policy decisions they're making. So that's one thing we do. The other thing we do is also think about how it will affect the healthcare assessors who are undertaking the health assessments, because that's really important. If you're having a policy change that actually is not, you're not able to roll it out because the healthcare assessors can't do that within a consultation, it's really important to think about that. And the third thing that we do is also think about the impact on the wider system, particularly the NHS. So I do a lot of cross-working across the Department of Health and Social Care and into the NHS, so that changes that we make or we think about making won't impact other services in a detrimental way.
So can I push you a little bit on that? So thinking about decisions that might be taken around specific policies. You've got a team of 12. How many of those of that number will be involved in doing that sort of prospective analysis in terms of the health effects of a policy change?
So most of the clinicians that work with me are part-time, so we actually have headcount more people, but it's the equivalent of 12 full-time. And it depends on the benefit line that's being worked on, because they're all split across different benefit lines. So within the WCA policy area, if we're specifically talking about that, all 3 of them, as well as myself and some of the senior leaders in the team, will be involved in that. And it depends on the policies that are changing. Obviously, if we're looking more at WCA, we'll bring more clinicians into that space. But if it's more about PIP changes or the industrial injuries benefit changes, then we will move clinicians around into those spaces so that we have the right amount of people working on the specific areas.
Okay. Can I ask you something that's very topical at the moment, obviously, in terms of winter fuel payment changes? Were you involved in that?
So we weren't involved in the winter fuel changes right at the beginning when the policies were being changed, because it's actually not within the disability area. So my role sits within the disability services area, whereas the winter fuel sat in a slightly different area. So we weren't involved initially, but I have subsequently been.
Okay, so you're not then, you don't cover all of the policy areas across the department, just specific ones that relate to specific disability benefits, is that right?
So the biggest area that my team covers is the disability benefit services. So we're looking at PIP, we're looking at WCA, child DLA, attendance allowance, we're looking at the industrial injuries benefits. But we also cross-work across the department in other areas, so such as our health transformation area, where we're looking at prospective changes to policies, but mainly it's the disability benefit area.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Jill.
Thank you, Chair. And welcome. Thank you for setting out the clinical governance work. That outline was really helpful just to get a better understanding of that. I wondered if I could ask you more specifically about how your work feeds into safeguarding policy, and obviously in particular for safeguarding vulnerable claimants, as we've been talking about today.
Yeah, so safeguarding is a really important part of my work, particularly from a clinical point of view. So when I came into the department 16 months ago, there had already been the beginnings of an external review on clinical governance, and I came in and the report was issued in December after I'd started, so about 3 months after I'd started. Looking at that clinical governance review, I've implemented every single recommendation. Some of those were safeguarding related. So one of the things that I've done, one of the immediate things I did was I've appointed a safeguarding clinical lead for the department. So we now have a level 4 trained doctor working in the department for the first time, which is an excellent addition. We've written a clinical safeguarding policy, which we share with our providers. So the 4,500 clinical assessors that are out in the system also follow our safeguarding process. We've changed the safeguarding training. So when I looked at it, what I decided to do following looking at the report and talking to our educational experts is we've changed our mandatory training for all of our healthcare assessors. So as of when the contracts changed over in September last year, every single healthcare assessor, so all 4,700 plus of them that work in the department within DWP but also in the assessment space, will now be level 3 safeguarding trained in both adult and children safeguarding. I've also helped set up a cross-government safeguarding group because it's really important we learn from best practice across government. So we work very closely with the Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Justice, Department of Health and Social Care, safeguarding leads as well, so that we are learning best practice and ensuring that we're rolling that out, and have made significant links with the NHS England experts who are helping to guide us.
Thank you. So you're confident that the health assessors are up to speed with what they need to know?
We launched, when the contracts changed over, we launched our new clinical governance process, which includes the new mandatory training, and it also includes the fact that we've taken over all of the education and training for the healthcare assessors now as well. So there's a huge body of work to do. We're going to give the providers 12 months in the same way we would in the NHS for people to come up to speed. So at the moment, everybody will be level 2 trained. But by the end of this year, they will be level 3 trained, and we've developed a new digital dashboard. So all of the training will be monitored, so we'll actually be able to see compliance and track that in our monthly meetings that we're having with the providers as well.
Great, thank you. And just as an additional question, we've talked about service modernisation, and of course the white paper has been published by the government looking at how we do things differently. So I wondered how your work impacts on that, looking at the modernisation that might go ahead.
Yeah, so any changes that are put forward potentially with white papers or green papers, my team will be involved in as long as it's within that disability benefits area. And we will add our clinical advice. Now, we are not the decision makers on those papers, of course. We're the clinical, and we are very much clinical advisors. But we will ensure that we have the clinical best evidence and best practice that we put in front of our ministers and our senior leaders within the department to help them make the decisions that they will then make based on those white papers and green papers that come through.
Thank you. David Pinto-Dudzinski.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Allsopp, the previous Secretary at DWP told the predecessor committee that part of your role was to be responsible for reviewing all prevention of future death reports. Have you drawn out any trends or findings in this work?
Yeah, so thank you. When I first came into the department, it was one of the first things that I asked about and went straight to the team who oversee the prevention of future death reports, because there's such an important piece of information that comes from the coroner to make sure that organisations can improve, and I've worked on them in previous roles in other organisations. There are actually not very many that come through to the department, so finding trends out of prevention of future death reports is actually difficult with the low numbers that come through. However, as part of the clinical governance review, I set up a new clinical governance board. It's chaired by a non-executive director of DWP, and it feeds into the governance structures. And within that board, we actually have tables this month. I think it's later this month anyway, at some point at the end of the month. On our clinical governance board, we have a summary of the prevention of future death reports that have come in over the last year, where we're going to look to see if there are any trends identified. And one of the decisions the board will be asked to make is how often we want those prevention of future death reports bought. The board sits every 3 months, as they also, of course, go to our serious case panel as well. So this is an additional measure that we've put in place to actually start to look at those trends in addition to the serious case panel as well that exists.
Okay. And when you say they're very few, how many is very few?
So since I've come in 16 months, I think there have been 5 that have come in. So I've co-signed 2 of them. 2 were already in train when I first started. So I've co-signed 2, and there's another 1 that is in process at the moment.
Great. And you mentioned they go to the clinical governance board, they go to the serious review panel, but then after that, how does the department use the findings that you produce?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have been very keen to do in the Clinical Governance Board is ensure that we are increasing our learning as an organisation. So there are 2 levels of the clinical governance that I've set. So the first one is the Clinical Governance Board chaired by the Non-Executive Director, which is a director-level board that is cross-cutting across the organisation. So it has our operations teams, it has our policy teams within that, as well as other experts. We also have a different level of board, which is more of an operational level board, that also includes our provider organisations. So any learning that comes out of our clinical governance board is then passed to what we call our clinical policy expert group, our clinical policy subgroup. And that learning then is passed to not only the providers, but also those operation teams and policy teams that are there as well. So we're trying really hard in a clinical space to ensure that that learning is spread across the department.
Right. And is there any follow-up to that? Knowing something about large bureaucracies, inputting the information is one thing, checking it's actually been acted on is quite another.
Yeah.
What are the safeguards around that?
Absolutely. So the team that oversee the prevention of future death reports hold that data and are constantly looking to see whether the actions have been actioned and what the outcomes for those are. Again, that's something we're bringing to the clinical governance board, because what I want to do is have visibility across that director level so that we can see what's been done and what hasn't been done. So that starts this month.
Great. Two final quick questions. One is picking up on Jill's previous excellent points around governance, but then also is about, you mentioned being a learning organisation. To what extent have you looked at other parts of the public services, other parts of the public sector, be it schools, be it medical, etc., to kind of learn and incorporate best practice into these processes?
Yeah, so I'm bringing best practice from the NHS. I've worked in the NHS for 30 years in lots of different leadership positions, but I've also held positions in arm's length bodies and in charities as well, affiliated with the NHS. So my expertise coming into the department is really bringing that wealth of my own experience. But I think more importantly than that is the partnerships I bring to the department. So there's no way I can be a font of clinical knowledge for everything, and I don't attest to be. But what I do have is the connections with all of those experts. So for safeguarding, for example, working with the NHS England safeguarding expert, but also within other government departments, making sure we're working across those departments as well, so that the best experts that I can have to advisors are actually there by our side doing that.
Great. And final question. Following the death of Errol Graham, we understand the department developed new advanced customer support guidance on supporting vulnerable claimants. Can you tell us about how that guidance is used and what impact you think it's had?
So the AXLs aren't within my remit and my sphere of working, so that they sit under the customer experience. There are two sides to DWP, and I think listening to some of the evidence earlier on, sometimes that gets a little bit confused, in that there is one side, which is the job centre side, and the work coach side, which is where the AXLs sit. And then there's the assessment side, which is slightly different. We do communicate, we do work very closely together, but actually the AXLs sit on the side within the job centres, which is out with the remit where I work.
And sorry, I'm going to cheat and ask one further question. How then do you make sure that a proper clinical oversight is applied not just to the assessment side, but to the other side of the house? That sounds like that there's a risk of siloing there.
Yeah, no. So one of the ways that we're avoiding that siloing, and you're absolutely right, it's a risk, and I've worked in other organisations where that risk is absolutely live. That's one of the reasons we've set the clinical governance board up, and we've set it at director level so that we have those absolute key people around the table, and they are there. It's a decision-making board that then feeds into the executive team and our Director General boards that sit there as well. So we've been very careful at both levels from a clinical governance point of view, not only the clinical governance board, but also that working level board, to make sure that every side is there. So the operations team as well are part of that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Allsopp.
German. Thank you. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the role that you play on the serious case panel and what you bring to the table, if you like, from your position.
Sure. So I was very happy when I first started to meet the Permanent Secretary, who immediately invited me to join the serious case panel, because it's such an important panel at DWP, and as I'm sure you know, has most of the Director Generals sitting on it, and is also chaired by a non-executive director, and the Permanent Secretary sits there too. So my role is to bring the clinical side, and I bring that from three aspects, I think. The first is to say the changes or the events that happen, or the themes and trends that we see at the serious case panel, how does that affect the claimants? Where's the claimant voice in that? The second bit is, where are the health assessor voice in that, and actually what are we seeing is going to affect those healthcare assessors. But then thirdly, that wider situation, how can we bring best practice from other organisations, how can we bring those links and the wealth of the connections that I bring to the department to make sure that we are bringing that best practice in. So it's those three-pronged approach really that I bring to the serious case panel.
Thank you. And of course the learning, as you've already mentioned, in relation to prevention of future deaths, the learning from any kind of panel or piece of work is absolutely crucial. Yeah. And I know that the committee in its previous incarnation received evidence to say that the serious case panel isn't sufficiently transparent. I wondered what your thoughts are on that and how much confidence we can have with the actions of the SCP.
Yeah, so I think previously the committee was told that it wasn't transparent, but I believe now the minutes are now open on the website and they're seen. So I think the transparency has increased, and I know that the department, certainly over the last 12 months since I've been present, is talking much more proactively about being transparent. And from my point of view as a clinician, it's absolutely key. You know, I have to sign a probity statement every single year to maintain my registration. It's really important, the transparency, and the more of that we can do, the better, I think.
And so the proper scrutiny and building confidence in its work, you would say that transparency is crucial.
Transparency, of course, is key to anything, isn't it? But we have to be very clear. I know some of the previous people that gave evidence talked about sharing data outside of DWP. We have to be super careful when we are talking about vulnerable individuals. Yeah. We've got to make sure that we protect the vulnerable individuals. And one of the things that I did when I came in is we've appointed a Caldecott guardian. So Caldecott is the principles of how do we share data. We have lots of information transferred from the NHS to us. It's absolutely crucial that we look after that data in the right way and make sure that we protect those people. So we've got to make sure that the transparency is at the right level. What we can't be doing is divulging information that puts people at risk.
Absolutely, and I was going to lead on to, obviously there's a need for proper scrutiny, but that can be really difficult if you know that things are going out into a public forum. So it is a fine balance, as you say. Would you have any thoughts on how that balance could be best achieved?
That's why I appointed a Caldecott guardian. I think so. We've got an excellent data protection team working in DWP. You know, really very, very good data protection team. The Caldecott guardian brings the ethical side of it to that conversation, which I think is a real addition. And the department didn't have to appoint a Caldecott guardian. They've done it because they think it's best practice, and that's supported again by the Clinical Governance Board and by the Permanent Secretary, and our ministers were aware that we were appointing. And I think it's a really good addition so that we start to think differently. And actually we can bring those ethical considerations in as well, rather than it being black and white, just data protection. We've got to start thinking more holistically, I think, about the claimant that's at the centre.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can I just have a couple of follow-up questions, if that's okay? I absolutely share your the importance of a Caldecott guardian and what that means, and particularly in terms of the transparency aspect. Does that then apply to the reports that you will do and your team will do to prospectively assess the health effects of policy changes? Will those also be published on the DWP website?
So there are limitations in what we can publish, particularly when we are doing policy development, because of course if ministers are still waiting to decide on making decisions, that's covered by certain data protection exclusions. So it's really important that the ministers and the department is able to make those decisions in a safe space. So the evidence that we give to help make those decisions are available, but they will only be released on either published because of ministerial approval or from a freedom of information if it meets the criteria to be released under freedom of information. However, I will, as a Chief Medical Advisor, I am expected to provide an annual report each year which goes to our executive team, and I am in conversation at the moment with our Permanent Secretary as to whether the Permanent Secretary and Minister would be happy for that to be published, and I would hope within that then it will be much more transparent about the safeguarding referrals that we do, something called our unexpected finding process, which is a safety net for claimants, and that the progress that we've made, particularly from a clinical point of view over the last 12 months.
Thank you for that. An ultimate question, specifically on the IPR process. Is that obviously the IPR process is identifying claimants who've died or been subject to serious harm. That we believe, as the NEO report from 2020, which you're probably familiar with, indicates that this is probably the tip of the iceberg. What is your view, being in post 16 months, about the actual scale of the deaths of claimants?
It's really difficult, isn't it? I'm very much aware of the criticism that it is pulled to the department, and we've heard some of that this morning. The thing that is super important whenever we think about a death is it's normally incredibly complex, particularly if you're talking about suicide. And I think you will see from most adult safeguarding review processes, there's never a single reason that somebody takes their own life or somebody dies. It's normally incredibly complex and is multi-agency. And certainly if you look at the prevention of suicide plan from the government in 2023, there's a 5-year plan to help suicide prevention. We're part of that work from the Department of Work and Pensions, and it really is important that we work cross-agency. The really key bit for me are the prevention of future death reports, because that is the point that a coroner looks at a death and says there is some aspect where DWP was involved, or DWP may be able to make changes to prevent deaths in the future, and they are the absolute bit for me that are really important. And from what I've seen thus far, those numbers are not, they're not, certainly not in double figures. They're, like I say, in 16 months I've seen 5 come through the door. So, and they are the figures that I'm going on in terms of deaths that are associated from a DWP perspective.
Okay, those PFDs are statutory reporting from a coroner. They're very rare reports. You must admit, I don't know how many you came across in terms of in your work with the NHS. They are incredibly rare. So my concern is, first of all, it's only unexplained deaths that will go to a coroner. And we really don't understand fully the detail of the scale of deaths. Errol Graham, for example, didn't die by suicide. He starved to death. So anyway, I will leave that with you. Just final question. Who do you report to?
So I report into the Policy Director General, but have very, very close workings with most of the directors across the department. So I work within the Disability and Health Services Directorate with the Policy Director and with the Disability lead, the Director General that's there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Allsopp. Thank you for coming to see us.
Thank you.
And a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Antonia Dietmann. You are the department's Chief Clinical Psychologist, but you also have a number of titles: the Head of Profession for Occupational Psychology in DWP, and the Head of the Government Occupational Psychology Profession. So that's quite an extensive remit. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Of course, yes. First of all, I would need to make one correction. I'm not a chief clinical psychologist, I'm a chief occupational psychologist.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, I'm delighted to be here to present evidence to this committee. I'm bringing my evidence based on my psychology perspective, and that's in the remit of occupational psychology. So I am the chief psychologist and the head of profession for occupational psychology, and there are 3 key parts to my role, with the first 2 being under the remit of the chief psychologist. First, I lead a scientific advisory team of 4, including me, registered occupational psychologists, and we provide advice to DWP's policy group on the design and development of all public policy for social security customers. Second, I'm the professional lead for the 85 psychologists that work in DWP's work psychology service. I don't line manage those work psychologists, but I provide the professional leadership to ensure that the service they deliver is appropriate, ethical, safe, and in line with British Psychological Society and Health and Care Professions Council requirements. And then that third role is that head of profession responsibility, and that's really a wider responsibility for the development of the whole profession, including people who are at the very start of their psychology training.
An extensive remit. How do you balance all the different jobs, and particularly your responsibilities at the DWP?
It is hard to balance it, but I love my job. So I enjoy trying to find a way to balance it. And actually, all of the three roles kind of do complement each other, really. So they're all drawing on my expertise as an occupational psychologist. My work within policy group helps me understand the policy development process, and then I can apply that to the work psychology side, and that's the operational delivery of our psychology service. So they do all overlap in some way.
And what's the relationship between the Chief Medical Advisor and the Chief Occupational Psychologist?
Gail and I work very closely together, so she's mentioned the Clinical Governance Board. I sit on that board, for example. We fall under the remit of clinical governance because we are regulated professionals, so we're not clinicians, we don't call ourselves clinicians, but we are regulated by the Health and Care Professions Council, as are other clinicians in the department and in the provider space, so it's right and proper that we fall under clinical governance, and we do the same, have the same training requirements, have the same reporting requirements under clinical governance.
And Dr. Allsopp was mentioning in terms of the analysis of policy and the sort of system-wide approach around the impacts of policy on the health of claimants. So are you involved in that from an aspect of the impact on mental health, or...?
No, we wouldn't really, that's not our sphere of expertise in occupational psychology. So the work of my policy advisory team, we are a source of scientific advice for policy officials as they're developing a wide range of policies, and we provide advice. It's for the policy officials to decide whether to take that advice in balance with every other source of advice they get from internal and external sources.
So does that mean that a policy you review, you undertake policy analysis, and then feedback to them? These are the what we think the impacts will be on mental health.
Not exclusively on mental health. So if I give you some perhaps more concrete examples, some of the work that we've done in our policy team. So, for example, we've provided advice on career development, career sustainability for the development of the new National Jobs and Careers Service. We have explored an employment intervention for customers who are 50 plus, for example. So we tend to co-create with the policy lead, and we work with them from the start of their policy initiative or their policy idea.
Okay, thank you very much. And you also you have a responsibility for the 85 psychologists across the JCP network. Mm-hmm. First of all, how are they sort of distributed, and what do you do to around their support and their training?
So there are 85 psychologists in the work psychology service, and there's one representation in each universal credit region, including Scotland and Wales. We don't have one work psychologist in every job centre, but rather one work psychologist will oversee a number of job centres, and then a senior work psychologist will oversee a particular region. If I can share with you what exactly they do on a day-to-day basis. So they support the employment journey of customers who have disabilities and health conditions, and they do this not by addressing the health condition or disability directly, but indirectly through helping them towards work, so they can progress on their employment journey. They do direct customer work both one-to-one and in groups, and all of those interventions will address at least one of 4 scenarios. So first of all, building the belief in the customer that they can work, exploring their strengths and their interests to support work choices, and exploring their fit with different work options, and then maximising the chances of actually securing that job. So that's their direct customer work, and then they also work indirectly with our DWP colleagues, building their capability to support their own caseload. So, for example, the work psychologists provide knowledge sharing sessions, upskilling sessions, literature and information that work coaches and disability employment advisors can use in their own service delivery.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to John Mill now.
Thanks, Chair. I think you've already partially answered my question, actually, but obviously you've got 85 psychologists across a lot of job centres, and what's the mechanism for referring claimants to them? How do they actually get involved? How are they brought in?
Absolutely. So referral is by a work coach or a disability employment advisor. It's entirely voluntary, so the customer must consent to that referral, and it's not tied to their receipt of benefits in any way. So we have regulatory requirements from the Health and Care Professions Council to get informed consent, and that is absolutely at the heart of the relationship between the work psychologist and the customer. So they have a structured pro forma to get that consent after the referral is made, and there's a conversation between the work psychologist and the work coach or disability employment advisor about whether that's an appropriate referral for that customer at that time. So once that's made, the consent will be obtained from the customer, and as I say, a structured pro forma. And we also have access to easy to read literature, which is highly simplified for our customers with low literacy or cognitive impairments, and that will explain the interaction and who the work psychologist is in simpler language.
And do you feel that system is working well enough that the right claimants are being identified by the staff on the front line?
Done a huge amount of work to really build awareness and understanding of what the work psychology service does, what type of psychologists we are, and the appropriate customers that can be referred to us. So they work really closely in their local areas as well as kind of more on a national level to explain that. So I think, yes, we're getting appropriate customers, and we wouldn't accept the referral as well if it wasn't the right customer that could be helped.
Fantastic. And it's been suggested to me that perhaps psychologists are not always brought in at an early enough stage. You know, like we wait till claimants get really a long way down the line before they get referred. You know, they're already in a lot of trouble, and then their difficulties have become greater. You know, they've been out of work longer. Perhaps their mental state has declined further. Do you feel that the system is bringing in support at an early enough stage?
I think there's always a conversation to be had with the work coach and disability employment advisors, but in one sense that scenario that you're presenting is also the strength of the service. We're often brought in to unstick where something has got stuck, and we can use different techniques that a work coach just wouldn't have access to because of our special training. So in some ways, helping those customers that have become stuck in some way is the power of the service.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over now to Frank McNally.
Thanks very much, Chair. Good morning. Just perhaps building on the point made by John there with regards to the 85 work psychologists. In our earlier session, we explored the range of challenges facing vulnerable claimants, and a few moments ago you referenced the fact that the work psychologists have a role both in terms of supporting the customer but also in terms of supporting staff within the job centre. So given the demands that are being placed on the work psychologists, do you believe the number is sufficient?
So it is a good question. I think there are really two factors when we have to consider the size of the work psychology service. First is the availability of relevant graduates. There are only 23 British Psychological Society approved programmes in occupational psychology in the UK. So they don't turn out a huge number of graduates, and then the number that will then want to work in the civil service and want to work in DWP's work psychology service. So we've got the supply side. And then, of course, we have available funding in DWP as well. There are professional costs to growing an in-house, highly competent, registered occupational psychologist when the market just won't provide them for us. So we have to balance those two competing factors in deciding on the size of the work psychology service. And what we've done is design a national service offer. So there's consistency across the UK. People access, work coaches, disability employment advisors access the work psychology service consistently in the same way and through the same process. But we also complement our face-to-face delivery to our customers with our digital offer to colleagues. So whether that's live broadcasts, knowledge sharing sessions, but also importantly case conferencing, where the work coaches can bring their cases to, a group of work coaches can bring their cases to a work psychologist and work through their caseload and try and unstick some of their challenging situations.
And I suppose, how does your role specifically support the work psychologist in terms of managing those competing demands? What's your, I suppose, your exact role in supporting the service to prioritise?
So I've kind of got a number of ways to do that. I support the psychologists to develop their evidence-based and consistent set of toolkits that they can use, and then I support them to identify the service they offer, maximise resources, how can we best deploy those resources, and then also importantly to decline tasks that can be done elsewhere in the department, things that fall outside of our remit. It's very important for me personally and for us as psychologists to remain within our professional area of expertise so that the work psychology service keeps an employment first rather than a health first focus, and my leadership helps us do that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And handing it over to Damien Egan now.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask some questions which are focused on the work of the JCP psychologists with the work coaches. You've kind of talked a bit about that already. I guess, what role do they have in ensuring the kind of well-being side of the work coaches? Do they get involved in that kind of occupational side?
So we don't have a role in welfare or well-being support. I don't have a role, and the work psychologists don't have a role in that. Really, that falls under DWP's wellbeing strategy and all of the support and provision that the department provides through our HR processes. So we've got our employee assistance program, for example, which colleagues can access. We've got a whole range of resources on the intranet, including our wellbeing TV channel, which covers a huge range of wellbeing and welfare topics.
The previous chief psychologist said that he was involved with helping DWP to develop improved guidance for frontline staff. How involved are you with the development of safeguarding policy for frontline staff? And can you point to any specific examples?
Okay, so I do provide advice to the people and capability team who have been developing training on topics that include safeguarding and vulnerability. I think I've provided advice on about 9 different training products since I've arrived about 23 months ago.
If I may, Chair, can I just go back to the point around, so that sort of work psychologists mainly focus then on the customers, which makes sense. John was asking in terms of like the success that they have in identifying people. In terms of the success of actually getting people into work, how is that monitored, and would you describe that their work as being successful?
So we do obviously collect feedback from both the customers that we see and also the colleagues that we see in the delivery of the interventions, whether it's case conferencing or training. But it's important to note that the customer remains on the work coach or disability employment advisor's caseload. The work psychologists don't caseload, so any success or outcome on their employment success is attributed to the work coach or disability employment advisor. But I did wonder if the committee might be interested in anecdotal feedback, but it just came into my inbox this week, and I wanted to share some feedback about a work psychologist. So this is directly from a customer. The work psychologist helped me immensely. When I first met them, I didn't know what the future held for me with regards to work due to the long-term effects of mild traumatic brain injury. My sessions have helped me reaffirm my confidence in my abilities and find coping strategies to dealing with any significant changes that I can then bring to the workplace. So we get those kind of feedback.
Really nice. Really Does that mean that we don't have a way, or can a way be developed where we can kind of quantify how successful that programme, that investment in those 85 work psychologists are? And there's just a slight follow-up to that, given you're talking about the supply issues in terms of number of graduates coming through. In the future, do these people have to be graduates, presumably psychology graduates, or is there an opportunity for work coaches to be brought up to that level and trained to give that support?
So I'll take the first part first. So yes, we do track an awful lot of other metrics about our service delivery, and we have a more available. And on the second part, I think it'd be very hard to upskill a work coach to the same degree. So a work psychologist has done 3 years of a BSc in psychology, 1 year of a master's in occupational psychology, and between 1 to 4 years of a professional qualification to become a registered and chartered psychologist. So it's a totally different kind of route way.
Are we able to see the metrics that get used around like the ones that you're using in terms of the success of getting people into the programme?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Damien. And over to Jo Baxter.
Morning, thank you. So from an occupational health perspective, what do you perceive as the main barriers involved in moving people from being out of work on health or disability benefits back into the workplace?
I'm not an occupational health practitioner, so I think I couldn't answer that question. It's really outside my professional area of expertise.
So several organisations have argued that removing the substantial risk descriptor from the work capability assessment would put vulnerable claimants at risk. In your professional opinion, is that claim warranted? And if the government chooses to go ahead with this measure, do you know of any ways in which that risk could be mitigated?
Again, I'm not a medical practitioner, I'm not a medical doctor, so that really would fall out of my professional area of expertise.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Dr. Dietmann, for providing evidence to the committee. That concludes our oral evidence session on the Safeguarding Vulnerable Claimants inquiry. Order, order. Thank you so much.